Coming up on Chopper's Political Podcast. She told one minister on one occasion that he was perhaps better suited to the stage than to politics.
Welcome back to Chopper's Political Podcast. I'm Christopher Hope, GB News' political editor, bringing you the best news, gossip and stories from the heart of our Westminster studio. For me, politics started to go a bit balmy in 2014 when the UK nearly broke up after the Scottish independence referendum. Then came the 2015 election, win for the Tory party, the 2016 EU referendum, the 2017 election, the 2019 election, the Boris Johnson landslide, Brexit, the collapse of Johnson's government, Liz Truss, Rishi Sunak, and then the July 2024 Labour landslide. It's been quite a journey for many of us, quite a ride, and charting the way through this for many of us has been my friend Tim Shipman. He's the Sunday Times' political editor for a lot of that time, 2014 to 2021, and is now the paper's chief political commentator. But he's maybe as well known as the Boswell de nos jours of our modern political times, with 4 books offering an insider's guide to this political drama. The first one was All Out War, the full story of how Brexit sank Britain's political class, 2016. Fallout, the year of...
I'm sorry. Oh, for God's sake. I put it on airplane mode. I thought that was going to do the job.
He's really not really a broadcaster yet, is he? He does a lot of broadcasting.
Hey Siri, power off.
But he's maybe as well known as the Boswell of our times, with 4 books offering an insider's guide to all of this political drama. They are All Out War, the full story of how Brexit sank Britain's political class, 2016. Fallout, a year of political mayhem, get it, 2017. No Way Out, Brexit from the backstop to Boris, 2024. That was in, I think, April this year it came out. And finally, out this week, Out is called, How Brexit Got Done and 4 Prime Ministers Were Undone. An epic effort, and he's with me now for this podcast, a special edition for your weekend listening. Tim Shipman, welcome to Chopper's Political Podcast.
Thank you, Chopper. I'm exhausted just listening to all that.
Can I give you a present before you start? Here it is. It's a GB News mug for you and Lady Shipman to drink your morning tea from at home.
I'll put it next to the one of your giant mug on a mug,
yes,
which we have in our kitchen.
It's got my face on that one.
The last time I did this podcast in April.
One of the previous books, that's right. How many words have you written in all these books? You must have counted it up. Is it millions?
I think it's about 1.1 million.
Goodness me.
Which is not far off twice as long as War and Peace.
Yes, yes. But perhaps more interesting than War and Peace. I mean, I've got the book here. I've had this in my rucksack at work, trying to read it on the train home. It is a hefty tome, isn't it?
It is, but that covers 5 years. I mean, the first book covered about 5 months, and the second one covered about 15 months.
Yes.
The third one covered about 2.5 years, and this is 5 years worth. It's the whole of Johnson, Truss, yes, Sunak and the election. And, I mean, if you've waded through 700 pages of Theresa May's agonising battles with Parliament, this is kind of the cathartic reward at the end of it.
Yes.
This is, I think, the most fun one. 600 pages of Boris Johnson doing what Boris Johnson does. Which
and are the books different? The first and second ones dealt with a year each, didn't they? And then you've had the one, say 2016, 2017, the first 2 books, and then the 2 books most recently deal with a longer time span. And does that change how you write? Because I think people thinking back over a couple of years get a different view of where they were than the immediate recollection.
I mean, I guess the thing is, it's not just the time period you're covering, but also when you're writing. So the first 2 I turned around very quickly. The first one was written in about 3.5 months
on Brexit itself,
on the referendum. So that all came out sort of later that year. And the same with the second book, which was primarily about the 2017 general election. And that, again, was turned around very fast. The last 2, which have kind of been written almost sort of simultaneously, have just been desperately wading through events and trying to catch up to sort of the present day and never quite pulling it off until we got to the general election. So you have to decide where to zoom in and out, but people have kind of got used to a certain level of detail, and if you like this sort of thing, you'll like it a lot. If you don't, then you're probably not listening to this podcast anyway.
It was traumatizing to go through it, and I'm starting to read this stuff. I mean, initially, I must admit, your first book, I was so such hard work covering it as journalists back in 2016, 17. I couldn't face doing it all again, reading your books, but I'm finding them more entertaining the further I get away from it.
Well, I mean, they try to be entertaining. I mean, there's some serious stuff in there, obviously, and what I try to do is give all the politicians a fair shake and judge them on whether they achieved what they wanted rather than what I think was a good idea. And some of them succeeded, and the vast majority of them failed. But if you're going to wade through a 900-page book, I need to make sure that there's something entertaining on every page, and hopefully there is, in terms of amusing quotes or little incidents that you didn't know about. And then when you get to the really big events, getting inside the room and getting testimony from everybody who was there, and hopefully taking the reader, properly behind the curtain of what goes on in politics.
Yes. Why do people speak to you? I mean, in your introduction, you talk about how mainly it's on background and then sometimes quoted. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, what I do is I try and talk to people and just find out what happened, and they know the way I write is I try to reconstruct what went on. I don't say this person told me this or this person told me that. Sometimes it's kind of obvious who's probably given you the information, but hopefully most of the time not. And, it's all come from people who were in the room or people they talked to or people they explained their feelings to. But I try and get you inside people's heads, and I try and, get as many accounts as possible of key moments, because everybody's recollections are different. And even, frankly, minutes after things happen. I mean, some of these meetings, were leaking in almost real time. And others, I think back, it's in book 3, but the Chequers meeting that Theresa May held, where she's finally set a Brexit policy. I spoke to 11 cabinet ministers shortly after that finished and worked through the night to write a piece for the paper. And a lot of what I've written is based on that. But equally, I then did events, interviews after the event, and people are prepared to say more. And you say, why do they talk? Everybody, I think, recognised the kind of historic nature of a lot of these events and wanted to kind of participate and make sure that, the sort of record, the first kind of historical record was correct.
Which it is.
And they also, having read the first book, I think realised that pretty well everybody else was going to talk, and if they didn't, it would be other people's versions of events that were going to get sort of primacy. So, and I think hopefully people trust me to do it in a fair way and not to stitch them up. And if they tell me stuff, then now I'll try and fairly represent what they were about. And I think that's kind of how we've arrived at.
And how have you managed your duties at the Sunday Times? Because people tell me things. I normally try and get out there straight away because we're journalists, aren't we? But you have to hold bits back, don't you?
Well, look, people will, if there's a big set of events, I'll always write a big read for the Sunday Times about it, and people will tell me a load of things, and there's an immediacy to that which is quite useful for the books. But at the same time, some people who are now used to contributing to the books will say, this is for the paper, but you can only use this in the book because it would be too awkward if it came out now. And bluntly, it's not that difficult to navigate because they wouldn't tell me if they thought I was going to put it in the paper. It all ends up in the paper eventually when we do a serialisation. So the editor's very tolerant of that. And, people, you get as much information as you can when you can. And, in the process of writing the second and third books, I was sort of beginning to write the fourth book, I guess. People were telling me things.
There wasn't meant to be a fourth book, was
well,
there?
No, there was supposed to be one third concluding volume of, approximately the same length as the first two, which was about 600 pages. And in the end, 3 and 4 combined is about 1,600 pages. And my publishers were very tolerant, but I think took the view that, if we were going to do this properly and give people what they were expecting from the first 2 books, then it was right to kind of do 2 books, and it was right that they were reasonably long. And, sales so far would seem to suggest that people who've liked the others will buy this.
Well, they are.
And hopefully...
and libraries and students buy them, I think, because they are, as you say, the first. We maybe write the first draft of history in newspapers, but this is the first actual draft, maybe, because it's a proper book.
Well, and the great joy is getting on a university reading list. So sales for book 1 have sort of steadily picked up over the last 3 or 4 years because... students are buying the paperback. It's not enough to do more than buy you a good lunch chopper. But
yes, well, I will take lunch off you, Tim Shipman. In terms of Out, what's the best story in it, you think? The best bit of gossip in here? I'm sort of at the beginning of it, I'm afraid.
Well, the best bit of gossip is what the Queen thought about Boris Johnson, because Boris Johnson in his memoirs wrote this sort of long, rather cloying section about his great love-in with the Queen. It turns out in private her views were a little bit more nuanced.
What did she say about him?
Well, I think she she had an affection for Boris Johnson. And she, by all accounts, liked talking to him. Imagine if you've spent 2 years talking to Theresa May and then you get to speak once a week to Boris Johnson. I imagine that's
would cheer us all up, probably.
A good deal more entertaining. But I don't think she held him in the great respect that he felt that she did. And she told one minister on one occasion that he was perhaps better suited to the stage than to politics. And then...
Which I think is true, by the way. Because I think, just briefly on me, my view on Boris Johnson doesn't exist. He's called Boris Johnson in terms of his public persona. He's Al at home. The real person isn't Boris Johnson. It's a mask he puts on to cheer up the crowds. But behind the scenes, he's Alexander Johnson, Al Johnson.
I think that's true to a degree, though I think it's a mask that he's worn for so long that it's so sort of woven into him that I'm not sure he's able to separate the two anymore if he ever was. But... yeah, I think... and
the Queen, yeah.
So she was affectionate about him, but I don't think she held him in quite the respect that he hoped. And 2 days before she died, she had a gathering at Balmoral with some of her closest aides, and she was asked about Boris by one of them, and she said, well, at least that idiot won't be organising my funeral now that he's gone.
Idiot.
Which is a sort of quite punchy. It was clearly said with a modicum of jest, and this was recounted by that senior courtier to a member of the cabinet at the big Privy Council meeting just after she died, where the cabinet effectively accepts the new king.
The accession
Privy Council. So the one that Penny Mordaunt was chairing before she got the sword.
Yes.
So that was and then
that was Saturday morning, I think, from memory.
I think the best section of this book is probably the first bit, which is the last 6 months of 2019, where Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings are desperately trying to ram through Brexit, and they come up with a pretty aggressive political strategy. And there's lots of great stuff in there about, Boris Johnson deciding to prorogue for 5 weeks whilst parading around in Bermuda shorts and a pair of work shoes that he'd been playing tennis in, slightly bizarrely. He then gets Geoffrey Cox, the Attorney General, to sort of say whether this is lawful or constitutional. And Cox says it's both, but 3 times warns him, by the way, the Supreme Court might take the case and they might rule against you. And when the Cabinet were about to discuss it, Johnson phoned up Cox about 10 minutes before and said, Geoffrey, if you wouldn't mind not mentioning all that to the Cabinet. And Cox sort of rather foolishly goes along with that. So I thought that was...
foolishly or rightly, we got there in the end with Brexit.
Well, we did. I mean,
he's his lawyer, of course.
Yeah, no, I mean, Cox's view would be that if they'd made a political argument that they were justified in sending Parliament away so Boris Johnson could negotiate with Europe, then they might well have won in the Supreme Court. But because they did it in a sort of underhand fashion, it didn't work out that way. But so that was all fascinating. And there's some great sort of meetings between Dominic Cummings, who was his chief aide, and Helen McNamara, who was the Deputy Cabinet Secretary. On what occasions Cummings is trying to get Johnson to break the law by not sending the letter to Brussels that the Ben Act decreed that he had to, asking for an extension. Gosh. And McNamara's at home with her kids, one of whom is sick, the other of whom is having a phase where he wears a Wonder Woman outfit. And she's basically told to come in on a Friday morning to try and sort of see off this attempt to break the law. And she races in with, one in their pyjamas, one in a Wonder Woman outfit, and parks her car, races through the Foreign Office and the Treasury into number 10, thrusts her kids into the arms of someone and goes into this meeting where Dominic Cummings is saying, well, we'll just ignore the law, and if the police try and arrest Johnson, they'll have to batter the door down, and that would be great. And Helen McNamara points out that the police on the door of Downing Street would be the ones doing the arresting because they work for the Queen, they don't work for the Prime Minister.
Correctly so.
So this is, there's lots of sort of slightly farcical stuff that's still very important. But I'd very much take the view that was the one bit of the last sort of 8 years where politics was done properly with the studs showing, and Cummings and Johnson knew exactly what they were trying to do, and they succeeded in doing it. And they pushed through the thing that people had voted for. And I think
that's one of the key points of the book. I think that in fact the introduction that you talk about, you've got this long view of history, Tim Shipman, over all these different PMs you've covered: Cameron, May, Johnson, Truss, Sunak, and the Tory side. I mean, and I think you do conclude that if you know what you want to do, you can do it. But the trick is knowing what you want to do. That's the point, isn't it? And that's how you achieve things in politics.
I think there's 3 things. I think you need to know where you want to go. and quite precisely, not just vaguely. And that can come from your ideology, it can come from focus groups, it can come from all of those different things. But knowing where you want to go and then telling people, but also having the tactical skill to get there. So you need good people around you who are good at politics. But you need, as a leader, you need not only to be selling your vision of where the country needs to go, but also have that ability to communicate with the public and with your MPs and with the media and take people with you. And for that period, Boris Johnson and Dominic Cummings ticked all of those boxes, and their opponents often didn't, because they weren't where the country was on this issue. And Theresa May didn't know where she was going and got herself into a total muddle. And by the time she decided where she was going, nobody else wanted to go there.
Because Brexit meant Brexit, but no one knew what Brexit was.
No, exactly. And she had an opportunity to define it, and she didn't do so successfully until it was far too late. Liz Truss knew exactly where she wanted to go, but she didn't have a sensible tactical plan and ignored all the people who told her, perhaps do it like this, slow down, do it like this. And literally everybody warned her. People say, oh, well, she had all these Tory ideologues around her who wanted her to do the same thing. But Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor, Simon Clarke, who was a levelling up guy but was part of her economic quad, Chris Philp, who was her Chief Secretary, all these people agreed that they wanted to boost growth and do all this exciting stuff. But they all said you have to balance this with some spending cuts. And she basically said no. There was another occasion where she had to decide, how much are we going to bail out households on their energy bills, and the difference between capping their bills at £2,500 a year or £3,000 a year, that is a £10 billion decision. And Kwasi Kwarteng said, well, we should talk about this. And she said, no, just do £2,500. That's it. And when Simon Clarke was trying to set up enterprise zones, the Treasury wanted to cap the numbers, otherwise they'd have limitless areas of tax-free sort of business going on. And she just said to Clarke, no, I want hundreds, if not thousands of these things. And she sort of goes over to him in the cabinet room, flutters her eyelashes and says, you've got to live a little. And that's how the government of this nation was being done. And then Rishi Sunak, arguably, Truss didn't listen to her aides and did too much. And then Sunak didn't listen to his aides and did too little. And they were all desperately trying to get him to sell a big narrative about where he wanted to take the country.
We were waiting for that big speech, that big reset moment.
And it never came. No. All he wanted to do was govern in a kind of technocratic fashion. There's this scene at the start of his premiership where they're all desperate to get to Chequers and have a 2-day sit down with a whiteboard and work out the numbers, the messaging, the narrative. And he's not interested. He just says, I can run the bloody country. All right? That's you need to worry about the messaging, not me. And they finally persuade him to let them go to Chequers. And they turn up. He keeps them waiting for half an hour in the car park. They have about 2 hours of work. And then he says, well, thanks very much for coming. And off you go. And one of his aides... Dougie Smith, who's a bit of a trencherman, says, what, you're not going to feed us? And at this point, the poor old RAF people who run Chequers were dispatched to the kitchens. They'd not got any food in because Sunak hadn't told them they needed to feed 20 people. And in the end, some desultory bowls of soup were pulled out. And this Soupgate summit, no one could tell what the soup was. They just said it was very hot. That was sort of became emblematic of his complete refusal to knuckle down and do some politics.
Made worse because, of course, he pays for all the hospitality, and given he's a rather rich chap, he could afford a bit more of a spread than some soup, maybe. When it all ended, that government, I've always been struck, almost they kind of not properly discussed point of the election, I think, was that I was there in number 10, you outside, you were watching it, or you were there as well, when he said, I've been to the King, we're having an election. He did that, didn't he, to avoid his cabinet stopping him?
Yeah, I mean, he had...
It's a coup, basically.
Well, I mean, it's not a coup because he's the Prime Minister, and ultimately the decision is his. But it's the kind of decision that you would normally involve people in. He effectively told David Cameron and I think Jeremy Hunt the night before... Cameron was a bit iffy about it, but agreed to support him. And then he called in an inner circle of cabinet ministers to tell them that he'd already been to see the King and asked them for his support in the big meeting. And then he had a big meeting of the cabinet. I mean, it was all a fait accompli by then. And he marches out into the pouring rain. Yes. And they're forced to watch this on the television. And even one of the ones who'd been supportive and knew about the plan was sort of disappearing into the collar of his shirt as this was happening. And Esther McVeigh goes, what on earth are we watching here as this rain comes down? He refused to use an umbrella, they just weren't they didn't look like they were prepared. The Labour Party was far better prepared. It had been expecting an election in May and was ready for an election in May. The Tories didn't.
He never gave an answer on that. And of course, I was with GB News, was with him throughout the campaign. We'd often ask him, why are we doing this? Well, and he would say, it's all about a choice, right? I mean, he was making a choice.
Well, it was a choice. I mean, look, there are people in his team will tell you that they were worried that public sector pay deals would be very expensive, that the boats would keep coming, that they weren't going to get the interest rate cuts that they had hoped for at the start of the year, and that the OBR would not let them do another tax-cutting budget. But the guy who was there and was being paid a large sum of money to run the election, Isaac Levido, said, no, we need, if we're going to punch the Labour Party with both fists, that means new policy and an economic narrative. And we won't get the economic narrative unless we wait till the autumn.
And that was a memo you've seen, apparently.
I've seen the memo. There's extensive quotes from it in the book. And, that was presented to him at the start of April. And Sunak, in the end, had been in this massive funk since the late spring, early summer of 2023. I mean, there's remarkable details in there from people in his inner circles saying, that he just couldn't understand why no one was supporting him and the public couldn't understand. Why don't they understand that I'm right about this stuff? This was a guy who, in the words of one cabinet minister, had always done his homework and couldn't understand why the voters weren't giving him an A. He looked at Boris Johnson and saw a guy who didn't do his homework and thought, I can do the job better than this.
Yes.
And then when it came to it, he couldn't. And then he had that bizarre reset at the Tory party conference where he acted HS2, he acts smoking, and he said he was acting A-levels, and all that stuff was sort of picked out of a kind of smorgasbord box of policies, because it was just stuff that Rishi Sunak felt
Again, he didn't know what he believed in. It was actually your point about power.
And one of his
power.
aides even said to me, look, we wanted him to have this new project to keep him engaged. It's basically the bloke was too sad. We had to give him something to do. And then throughout the autumn, when all those people were trying to oust him, and there was, what people called, the grid of shit plot to get rid of him.
A grid is a news grid for listeners to understand. It's a planned announcement.
So they were planning all the stories they were going to leak to try and damage him. They didn't know how close they got to getting rid of him. On 3 or 4 occasions, I'm told, he sort of went to his aides and said, really, wouldn't we be better off without me? And I should stand down. And they said, well, it's completely crazy to get rid of another prime minister now. But if they'd got the number of MPs to force a vote of no confidence, one of his very closest aides said to me, he would have stood, he would have tried to win. We think he would have won, but I think he would then have walked off and said, well, stuff you lot. You're on your own now. So if they got the numbers, and we think they got...
There was chatter about this. I mean, in terms of... I've read Graham Brady's book is quite helpful on letters going in and all the debate of the last 14 years. And I did a piece reported for GB News on Twitter. Maybe 30 letters have gone in against Sunak, maybe in April or March. And in the book, he reveals there's only 6 at the time, and Chopper was wrong. He enjoyed telling me that.
There's lots of about me being wrong about letters at various points as well. But it's... I mean, look, the point is he was teetering.
Yes, he was teetering.
And it wouldn't have taken much to push him off his perch. But in the end, he called the election bluntly because he'd had enough. And he just... he didn't want the pain to continue, and he just felt like going for it. And it felt like they didn't feel like they were in control of anything. And that was the one thing he could control, and he could say, right, I'm making the decision to go and do it. But it was a disaster.
I'm loving the book. I'm still getting through it. But in the introduction, you do say, interestingly, you don't need to think about Boris Johnson as a great man to agree that he was the most consequential figure of this period. That's right, isn't it? I mean, people have this Boris derangement syndrome, don't they, on left and right? But he did kind of get this done.
Oh, totally. I mean, he is without question the most important figure in this entire period.
Did you rate him? Did you think his defenders say he got the big calls right on Ukraine, on vaccines during COVID, on getting Brexit done? He couldn't do the detail. He couldn't do the hospital. He's going to build 50 of those, police and the rest. He could do the small stuff well, but the big stuff he got right. Is that right on him? Or?
I think broadly that's right, though I would say that doing the small stuff matters in government and accumulates a sense of public dismay when it goes wrong. Look, my view of Boris Johnson is very clear. If you read this book and you want evidence that Boris Johnson is a very significant political character with astonishing campaigning skills, great charisma, brilliant communication, and for brief periods of his intensive activity and ability to focus laser-like and do the important things, then you will find plenty of evidence. If you think he's lazy, disaffected, disengaged, easily distracted, capable of having pointless feuds about nothing and obsessing about things that don't matter, you will find plenty of evidence in this book. This is, I hope, a properly rounded, nuanced picture of Boris Johnson. And if this book is nothing else, I hope it's that, because people resort to hatred or hagiography with Boris Johnson. This is the most rounded and favourable portrait of Boris Johnson that you will find outside of a book written by Boris Johnson or Nadine Dorries, but it is also highly critical in places.
Well, which of those...
Ultimately, he had a great opportunity to remake this country, and he blew it because of some of the ways he behaved and some of the ways he said...
fallibilities.
As I say, at the end, he was unable to defy the consequences of his own personality, and I think Boris Johnson, in his heart of hearts, knows that, which is why he spent a very great deal of time before this book was published trying to influence what I put in it.
Well, I was going to ask you about that. I mean, one of your books is called Fallout. Who have you fallen out with about this book? For example, that story about the Queen would have hurt him, wouldn't it?
It did hurt him. I wouldn't say we've fallen out. It's not for me to reveal conversations, but I think...
He loved the Queen, and you're saying she thought he was an idiot.
He thinks I was sold a pup by the cabinet minister who...
didn't like him much.
Who didn't like him, which, is
That's always a risk in your game, isn't it?
Of course it is. But this person has been an impeccable source of mine over multiple years, and I believe that is what the courtier told him. And the fact that I had other evidence from another minister who is, favourably disposed to Johnson suggests that it was of a piece with comments she'd made elsewhere. Yes. So that's why I was prepared to put it in the book. I didn't just rush to put it in for the sake of it. But was he hurt by that? Yes, I had what I describe as a 17-minute moan call from him that Saturday. Yeah. But equally, I've had a communication with him. He's contacted me since to say congratulations on the book and it all seems to be going well. And, Boris Johnson is not generally a grudge holder. And I think he knows if he reads every word of this book that he sees that it's a balanced portrait that fairly approaches what he tried to achieve.
So you haven't fallen out with anybody? I mean, not off speakers with anybody off this book? Is there
well, I don't think Theresa May is putting me on her Christmas card list anytime soon. Book 3 concluded with a chapter entitled Theresa May, A Study in Failure. Look, there are people who get miffed because I take something that somebody else has said and
don't believe them when they say it's not true. Or
I mean, there are people who are upset that my interpretation of something might not be the same as theirs. But I think everybody can see that I try and approach this as fairly as I can, and that equally there are judgments that go in their favour, and there are equally rude things about almost everybody else.
Some do say that I don't know who your sources are. Some say that some of these books are a Cummings view of history, Dominic Cummings. Do you worry sometimes that people want to use you to get their version of history out, and that isn't a fair version?
Well, everybody to a degree is trying to do that, which is why I try and speak to absolutely everybody. I mean, for the third and fourth book, I've probably spoken to well over 300 people, and pretty well everybody who we have an insight from has talked to me at some point or another. It is some of this from Dominic Cummings. It's perfectly obvious that it is. He's quoted on the record in the book. I happen to think that what he and Johnson did in the second half of 2019 was a masterclass in political strategy and execution. If Dominic Cummings thinks take a similar view about all of what he did for the rest of his time in Downing Street, he's going to be sorely disappointed.
Yes.
So, yes, some of it takes his view of the world, and a lot of it doesn't.
And just finally, Tim Shipman, of the Mount Rushmore of leaders you've covered, Cameron, May, Johnson, Truss, Sunak, who do you rate the most of those 5?
Look, I think there's different attributes. I think if you're looking for diligence and public service, it's Theresa May and Rishi Sunak. If you're looking for determination and bloody-mindedness, it's Liz Truss. But for me, the two that stand out are David Cameron, who I think clearly had the best temperament for the job, and Boris Johnson, who had the best sort of campaigning ability and communication skills. And those are not a sort of cheap add-on, as a lot of politicians seem to believe. They're absolutely core to the job. And I think those were the two guys with the most potential. And ultimately, Cameron blew it because he put himself in a position against where the public were. And on Brexit, Boris Johnson delivered on Brexit, but then put himself in a position where the public weren't when it came to parties and how he did the handling of his government. And they both are in a division or two above the other three in my book.
Yeah. And just finally, what was the best story that didn't make your book?
oh, well, that's unprintable, Chopper, and it will have to go in a future novel rather than a non-fiction tome.
It's the last one, is it? I mean, this is the there's a full stop at the end of the Tory 14 years in government. Are you applying a similar gimlet eye to the Labour government?
Well, look, I will continue to do that in the newspaper very regularly. Others are writing a book about Starmer, and my view is that I've kind of done my stretch for now, and I'm keen to go and write some spy fiction or something that. So that's my plan for book 5. But if the blonde bombshell decides to return, I guess some people will attempt to persuade me to take up my non-fiction keyboard again.
You're yoked to him for your career. Well, there we are. Look, Tim Shipman, thank you for joining us today on Chopper's Political Podcast. It's great to have you here. And as a good friend of mine over the past 14 years, and forever, well done.
Thank you, Chopper. It's been an interesting journey, and it's been good to have you along.
Thank you for listening wherever you are to this podcast or watching it. I tweet at Christopher Hope on X. Tim Shipman is Shippers Unbound. Email me, chopper@gbnews.uk, with any thoughts on what Tim had to say. If you enjoyed our podcast, please tell your friends. If you really enjoyed it, and Tim Shipman certainly has, he's got a free mug from it, at least nothing more than that, or please do leave a 5-star rating and a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify to help other people find this show. Thanks to the great team of GB News colleagues behind this podcast, Mick Booker, Jeff Marsh, Rebecca Nunes and George McMillan. But most importantly of all, thank you to you for listening. If you want more Chopper in your life, and Tim Shipman does, do catch me during the week on GB News, popping up with news and stories, and at midday on Wednesdays for PMQs Live with Gloria De Piero. And do keep up to date with our best political reporting on the website, gbnews.com. Until next time, from me and Tim, cheerio!